My name is Karen Mitchell, and for the past year, my life has felt like a sentence I never chose but couldn't walk away from. I work long hours at a furniture plant in Cleveland, sanding down rough wood until my hands ache and the fine dust clings to my clothes like a second skin. The plant whistle marked the end of another shift, and as I slipped off my gloves, a couple of my coworkers laughed about grabbing drinks at a bar down the street. They waved me over, inviting me to come along. I smiled, shook my head, and said I had somewhere to be. It wasn't a lie. I always had somewhere to be. That somewhere was a cramped two-bedroom apartment on the west side of the city where my 75-year-old mother-in-law, Margaret Whitmore, waited for me. Margaret wasn't bedridden. Not exactly, but her health was failing, and her spirit was as sharp as ever, too sharp sometimes. She had once been the formidable manager of a steel factory, a woman who knew how to command men twice her size, and she carried that authority like a weapon even now. Age hadn't softened her. If anything, it made her more determined to remind everyone that she was still in control. I stepped out of the plant into the gray Cleveland evening, the sky low with clouds, the smell of rain clinging to the wind. My coworkers' laughter faded behind me as I walked toward the bus stop, shoulders heavy not just from the workday, but from the knowledge of what awaited me at home. I had been living with Margaret since my husband died almost a year ago. It felt like a lifetime already. When he passed, there was no one else to look after her. She had outlived nearly all her friends, her siblings were gone, and her only child was buried in the cemetery on Lorraine Avenue. That left me. I told myself it was my duty, the last thing I could do for the man I loved. But every day since, the weight of that promise pressed harder on me. Margaret wasn't cruel, not exactly, but her words could cut. She questioned every choice I made, from the groceries I bought to the way I folded her laundry. Sometimes I wondered if she saw me as a daughter-in-law at all, or just an employee who had nowhere else to go. Walking up the cracked sidewalk to her building, I often felt like a prisoner returning to a warden. The comparison wasn't lost on me. I used to think of myself as independent, strong. But with Margaret, I felt like a girl again, stumbling under her disapproving eyes. And yet, mixed with the resentment was something softer, pity, maybe, or a lingering sense of loyalty. She was old. She was alone. She had lost her son, too. I reached the apartment door, fishing for my keys with fingers that still smelled faintly of varnish. My chest tightened, the same way it always did before I turned the lock. Inside was Margaret, perched in her chair like a dragon guarding a hoard, the television flashing light across her lined face. She would greet me not with warmth, but with questions, demands, reminders of how she used to run entire shifts of men without complaint. And me? I would nod, fetch her tea, listen to the same stories I'd heard a dozen times, and swallow the lump of frustration that rose in my throat. I told myself I was strong enough to handle it, strong enough to live in this tower with the dragon. But as I set my hand on the door that night, bone-tired and already bracing for battle, I wondered how much longer I could keep pretending that this was a life at all. The hallway smelled faintly of boiled cabbage and dust, the kind of odor that clings to old apartment buildings in Cleveland. I turned the key in the lock, bracing myself for Margaret's usual greeting, a sharp remark about my lateness or the groceries I forgot to pick up. Instead, what drifted through the thin door was laughter. Margaret's laughter, light, almost girlish. The sound startled me so much that I froze, hand still on the knob. I hadn't heard her laugh like that in months, maybe years. I eased the door open, careful not to make a noise. From the living room came her voice, bright and animated, carrying down the hall. Yes, of course I signed it. The people at the Golden Years Foundation are such professionals. They said they'll take care of everything, the meals, the nurses, even social events. A beautiful residence, not like these dreary apartments. She chuckled again, her tone warm and indulgent, as though she were confiding in an old friend. The words hit me like a blow. Golden Years Foundation. I had never heard of it, but the name alone made my stomach tighten. I set down my bag and stepped into the living room. Margaret sat in her worn recliner, the cordless phone pressed to her ear, her eyes sparkling in a way I didn't recognize. On the coffee table lay a thick folder. I caught the bold heading stamped across the top of one page. Quitclaim deed. For a moment, the room tilted around me. I grabbed the folder, flipping through the pages with trembling hands. It was all there in black and white. Margaret had signed over her apartment, our apartment, to this so-called foundation. She had given away the only roof over her head, the place my husband had grown up, the place I had promised to protect. She looked up, annoyed at the interruption, and pressed the phone against her chest. Karen, put that down. You don't understand. This is my choice. Your choice. My voice cracked. Do you even realize what you signed? This deed, this isn't a contract for care. It's a transfer of ownership. You gave them the apartment. It's not yours anymore. Margaret waved a dismissive hand, as though I were a child whining about chores. Don't be dramatic. They gave me proof. She reached into the folder and pulled out a single sheet of lined paper. The handwriting sprawled unevenly across the page, numbers scrawled in ink. $3 million. At the bottom was a signature I didn't recognize. See? A promissory note. They'll pay me when the time comes. I stared at the paper, heat flooding my chest. It wasn't notarized. No seal, no witness, not even a printed letterhead. Just words on paper, as worthless as the promises of the people who handed it to her. This means nothing, Margaret, I said, my voice low but shaking. It wouldn't hold up in court for a second. They conned you. They took your home, and they gave you trash in return. Her eyes narrowed, the sparkle replaced with steel. You always think you know better, don't you? You think I can't make my own decisions because I'm old. Admit it, Karen. You've wanted this apartment since the day my son died. You don't care about me. You just want the property. The words cut deeper than I expected, sharper than any insult she'd thrown before. I opened my mouth to argue, to plead, but nothing came. The truth was in front of us, plain and merciless. She trusted strangers more than she trusted me. I clenched the deed in my hands, the pages crumpling beneath my fingers. In that moment, standing in the dim glow of the living room lamp, I realized the battle ahead wasn't just against a faceless foundation. It was against Margaret herself and the wall of suspicion she had built between us. I didn't sleep that night. The quitclaim deed lay on the kitchen table where I had left it, its legal jargon swimming before my eyes. Every time I closed them, I saw Margaret's face, stubborn, almost triumphant, as if she had outsmarted me instead of walked into a trap. By morning, exhaustion had hardened into resolve. If she wouldn't believe me, then I had to prove it myself. Downtown Cleveland was still shaking off the night when I got off the bus. The wind off Lake Erie bit through my jacket as I followed the address printed on the paperwork. It led me to a building on Euclid Avenue, one of those faded office blocks that might once have held insurance agencies or travel bureaus. The sign on the front window was new, though, Golden Years Foundation stenciled in cheerful gold lettering. Inside, the air smelled faintly of fresh paint and stale coffee. A woman in her 30s sat behind a reception desk, scrolling through her phone. She barely looked up when I stepped forward. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone flat bored. I set the deed folder on the counter. "I'm here about this. Margaret Whitmore. You convinced her to sign over her apartment." The woman's smile didn't reach her eyes. Convinced? No one forced her. She chose to. We offer services to seniors: housing, medical care, companionship. In exchange, they sign over their property. Perfectly fair arrangement. My jaw tightened. Fair? You're stripping elderly people of their homes. That promissory note you gave her, worthless. You know that. She shrugged, tapping her manicured nails against the desk. Not my problem if she doesn't read the fine print. She got what she wanted. Security. We got what we wanted. Collateral. That's how business works. The casual cruelty in her voice made my stomach turn. I leaned closer, lowering mine. This is fraud. You're targeting people who can't defend themselves. If you don't undo this, I'll go straight to the police. For the first time, she laughed a short, dismissive sound. Go ahead. Everything's signed, notarized, filed at the county recorder's office. Legal as rain. The cops won't touch it. Her confidence chilled me more than her words. I gathered the papers and walked out, my heart pounding. The cold air outside felt like a slap, but it cleared my head. She was daring me to try. And I would. At the nearest precinct, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as I waited at the counter. The desk sergeant, a man with thinning hair and tired eyes, listened while I laid everything out. The deed, the promissory note, the story. He flipped through the papers, nodding occasionally, then pushed them back across the counter. Look, ma'am, he said, voice weary. I get that you're upset, but the deed's legitimate. Your mother-in-law signed it of her own free will. There's no evidence of coercion. As for this note, he waved it like a scrap of trash. You're right, it wouldn't hold up. But that doesn't make it a crime. You want to fight this, you'll need a lawyer. Civil court, not criminal. We can't help you. The dismissal stung worse than I expected. I stood there for a moment, gripping the edge of the counter, searching his face for even a flicker of concern. There was none. Just another overworked officer ready to move on to the next complaint. I shoved the papers back into my bag and walked out into the afternoon. The sky had darkened, clouds pressing low and heavy, threatening rain. I felt smaller than I had in years, a single person standing against a system that didn't care. But beneath the despair, something else burned, a stubborn flame I couldn't extinguish. They thought they could brush me off. They thought Margaret was just another old woman. Easy to trick, easy to discard. But I wasn't going to let them bury her or me without a fight. The phone rang early the next morning, just as I was pouring my first cup of coffee. The voice on the other end was firm but measured. Mrs. Mitchell? This is Detective Michael Harris with the Cleveland Police Department, Elder Fraud Unit. I'd like you to come in and talk about your complaint. For a moment, I just stood there, the mug warming my hands. I hadn't expected anyone to call me back. Not after the cold dismissal at the precinct. My pulse quickened with a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, someone was willing to listen. The downtown precinct felt different this time. Instead of the front desk sergeant brushing me off, I was led to a smaller office tucked away at the end of a narrow hallway. Detective Harris sat behind a desk stacked with files, his sleeves rolled to the elbow, tie loosened as though he'd been buried in paperwork all night. He looked up when I entered, his gaze sharp but not unkind. "Have a seat," he said, motioning to the chair opposite. I settled in, clutching my bag like armor. "I read your report," he began, flipping open a manila folder. "Your mother-in-law, Margaret Whitmore, signed a quitclaim deed over to the Golden Years Foundation. She also received a handwritten promissory note for $3 million. Correct?" I nodded. "Yes, it's a scam. She doesn't see it, but they're going to take everything from her." Harris leaned back, rubbing his chin. "You're not the first person to walk in here with that name. Golden Years Foundation has come up in several complaints, all very similar. Seniors sign away their homes in exchange for promises. Housing, care, financial security. When the dust settles, the property's gone, and the victims are left with nothing." The words should have been reassuring. Proof I wasn't imagining things. But instead, they landed heavy in my chest. "Then why haven't you shut them down?" His expression tightened, weary but steady. "Because the law isn't always as clear as we'd like. The deeds are signed voluntarily. No gun to the head, no forged signature. They get notarized, filed, and recorded properly. From a purely legal standpoint, it looks legitimate. Unless we can prove intent to defraud, it's nearly impossible to prosecute." I felt the spark of hope sputter. "So you're saying there's nothing you can do?" Not exactly. He tapped the folder. Your case has one detail the others don't. That promissory note. Most of the time, the scammers don't bother leaving anything behind. But if your mother-in-law insisted on a written guarantee, even a worthless one, that could be our opening. If we can show it was used to mislead her, to trick her into thinking she wasn't losing her home, it becomes evidence of fraud. I gripped the strap of my bag tighter. Then let's use it. Let's go after them now. Harris shook his head slowly. It's not that simple. Building a case takes time, surveillance, corroborating witnesses, financial records. And we don't have time. According to the deed, the Golden Years Foundation expects your mother-in-law to vacate the apartment in 2 weeks. Once she's out, they'll move in, renovate, maybe even sell it off. By then, undoing the transfer will be 10 times harder. 2 weeks. The words echoed in my head like a countdown clock. So what am I supposed to do? Just sit here and watch them take her home. His gaze softened slightly, though his tone stayed professional. I know it feels impossible, but you need to understand, we're up against professionals who know how to dance on the edge of the law. If you push too hard without evidence, they'll cover their tracks and we'll lose our chance. The best I can tell you is don't give up, but don't go at them alone. It's dangerous. I stood slowly, the chair scraping against the floor. My hands trembled, though whether from anger or fear, I couldn't tell. Detective, with all respect, watching her lose everything is not an option. If the system won't stop them in time, then I will find a way. For the first time, his stern face cracked with something almost like respect. He closed the folder, folded his hands, and gave me a single nod. Then, you'd better be ready for a fight. I left the precinct with Detective Harris's warning echoing in my ears, but giving up was never an option. If the law couldn't move fast enough, then I had to find someone who would. There was only one person who came to mind, Eleanor Brooks. Eleanor had been Margaret's closest friend for decades, though the two women hadn't seen each other as often since Margaret's health declined. Where Margaret was sharp and domineering, Eleanor was measured and sharp-witted, a woman who had once made her living in courtrooms as a civil attorney. Even in retirement, her reputation lingered in Cleveland. People still called her the Iron Lady in Pearls. I drove to her small brick house on the east side, the one with the tidy lawn and the American flag rippling from the porch. When she opened the door, her eyes widened in surprise. "Karen Mitchell," she said, her voice warm but firm. "I was wondering when you'd come." We sat at her kitchen table, the air thick with the smell of chamomile tea. I laid out everything, the quitclaim deed, the worthless promissory note, the foundation's smug employees, Detective Harris's cautious words. Eleanor listened without interrupting, her expression calm, her hands folded on the table. When I finished, she let out a slow breath. "I warned Margaret years ago," she said softly. "She's always been stubborn, but now she's lonely. Loneliness makes people reckless. These people know it, and they prey on it." "I can't stop them," I admitted, my voice breaking despite myself. "Not alone." That was when a new voice joined in. From the hallway stepped a tall man with the same sharp eyes as Eleanor. He was in his 40s, with neatly combed hair and a suit jacket slung casually over one arm. "You're not alone," he said. "I'm Daniel, Mom's son, defense attorney, and from what I just overheard, it sounds like you've got a case worth fighting." Something steadied in me at those words. For the first time in days, I didn't feel like I was shouting into the void. I was being heard. Eleanor leaned forward, her eyes glinting with that old courtroom fire. "We need to trap them, Karen. They think they're untouchable because the papers are clean. But if we catch them in the act, record their methods, their words, we'll have the leverage to bring them down. The law moves slowly, yes, but video evidence speaks loudly in court." Daniel nodded. "We'll set a bait. Mom will pose as a vulnerable widow, interested in their program. They'll come sniffing around. We'll document every lie they tell." The plan made my stomach clench. That's too risky. Eleanor, they drugged the tea they gave Margaret. Who knows what they'll try if they feel cornered? But Eleanor only smiled, the kind of smile that said she had faced down worse in her life. Karen, I've been arguing with sharks in suits since before you were born. I'm not afraid of a couple of grifters. If they want to play, we'll play smarter. Over the next hour, the three of us sketched out every detail. We would hide cameras in Eleanor's living room, one behind a bookshelf, another tucked into a vase. The furniture would be arranged to keep the visitors comfortable but visible from every angle. Eleanor rehearsed her role, a lonely widow with no children, desperate for company and care. Daniel drafted a list of probing questions designed to push the scammers into revealing contradictions. How do you guarantee care? Where does the money come from? Why can't I review the agreement with my lawyer? By the time I left that evening, Eleanor's house looked less like a home and more like a stage. My nerves hummed with dread, but Eleanor was unshakable. As I stood in the doorway, she rested a hand on my arm. "It's time, Karen," she said with quiet certainty. "We've let them steal from too many. Now we stop them." Her conviction settled into me like a spark catching flame. I still feared what might come, but for the first time I felt the tide might turn. The plan moved faster than I expected. Within days, Eleanor managed to make contact with one of the Golden Years Foundation's agents. The woman's name was Irina, a slender brunette in her late 30s with an easy smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She had been passing out glossy brochures at the local senior center when Eleanor approached her, playing the part of a curious widow with time to spare and no family to lean on. Later, when Eleanor told me how effortlessly Irina had bitten the bait, I felt both relieved and sickened. "She couldn't resist me," Eleanor said with a wry grin, her voice laced with irony. "I told her I was alone, with a nice house and a pension, just looking for someone to make my final years easier." She practically purred. Within 10 minutes, she was promising me comfort, community, and a room with a view. And of course, all it would take was a little paperwork. I sat in Eleanor's living room that evening, watching her rehearse her frail smile and halting speech. She leaned heavily on a cane she didn't need, her back curved just enough to sell the illusion. "Karen, dear," she said in a quavering voice, "you must understand it's hard to be alone." Then she straightened, her eyes sharp again. "Will that do?" "It's perfect," Daniel said from the corner, arms folded. His jaw was tight, his eyes scanning the hidden cameras we'd placed earlier, one behind a row of hardcover books, another tucked discreetly into a vase of silk flowers. The house looked the same as always, but every angle was now covered. Still, my stomach twisted with unease. "I don't like this," I admitted. "You're putting yourself right in their crosshairs. What if something goes wrong?" Eleanor's smile softened, though her tone carried steel. "That's the point, Karen. They think they're circling prey. They won't suspect they're the ones walking into a trap." 2 nights later, my phone buzzed. Eleanor's voice on the other end was calm, almost casual. She took the bait. "Irina is sending a representative to my house tomorrow afternoon to finalize the deal. Be ready." The next day stretched like wire pulled too tight. I couldn't focus at work, couldn't shake the image of Eleanor sitting across from some stranger who thought of her as nothing more than easy profit. By mid-afternoon, I was in Daniel's car, parked a block away from his mother's house. The cameras inside were linked to a laptop balanced on his knees, the grainy feed showing Eleanor pacing her living room, adjusting a doily on the coffee table, then sinking into her recliner like a tired old woman. Daniel's hands were steady on the keyboard, but his jaw flexed as he clenched and unclenched it. "She looks smaller than I've ever seen her," he muttered. "But don't be fooled. That's theater." I watched the screen, my own breath shallow. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow at the window made my pulse race. "She's too calm," I whispered. "That's Mom," Daniel said, his voice taut with pride. "She's been preparing for battles her whole life. This is just another courtroom. only the stakes are higher. On the screen, Eleanor smoothed the skirt of her dress, folding her hands primly in her lap. The performance was flawless, the picture of loneliness, frailty, and need. But behind her eyes, I knew the truth. This wasn't surrender. This was war, dressed in pearls and patience. The following afternoon, Daniel and I sat in his car, nerves stretched tight as wires, watching the live feed flicker on the laptop between us. Eleanor was in her chair, shawl draped loosely around her shoulders, her cane leaning nearby. She looked every bit the picture of an elderly widow about to be taken advantage of. Though I knew behind her steady eyes, she was sharper than anyone who might walk through that door. At exactly 3 o'clock, the doorbell rang. My chest clenched as a man stepped into view. He was younger than I expected, maybe late 20s, clean-shaven, with a slick haircut and a briefcase in hand. Alex, he introduced himself smoothly, though his eyes darted around the room with the alertness of someone who had played this game many times before. Mrs. Brooks, he said, his voice dripping with courtesy. Thank you for inviting me. I'm here to finalize your enrollment in our program. Eleanor's frail smile never wavered. Oh, thank you, young man. I do get so lonely here. She motioned him toward the couch. Please sit. Would you like some tea? He declined politely at first, but his eyes fixed quickly on the folder she had placed on the coffee table. We'll just take a moment of your time, ma'am. I've prepared the documents you'll need to sign. He opened his briefcase, pulling out the quitclaim deed, sliding it across the table with practiced precision. This transfers your property to Golden Years Foundation, which will in turn provide you with lifetime care. Eleanor leaned forward slowly, peering at the paper as if her eyesight were failing. Oh, dear, she murmured. I don't quite understand. Why does it say I relinquish all rights to the home? Surely I still get to keep it until I pass. Alex's smile stiffened. It's just legal phrasing, ma'am. Standard procedure. Nothing to worry about. Eleanor tapped the page with a trembling finger. And this section, why is there no mention of monthly care fees or oversight from the state? His patience thinned visibly. He straightened his tie, his jaw tight. Mrs. Brooks, these are technicalities. If you want our services, this is how it's done. Every one of our clients has signed the same form. Eleanor said, tilting her head. And what if I showed this to my lawyer first, just to be safe? At that, Alex's facade cracked. His smile dropped, his tone sharpened. Ma'am, with all respect, if you bring a lawyer into this, the foundation may have to withdraw its offer. These opportunities don't stay open forever. You'll lose your chance. From the car, I clenched my fists. Daniel muttered, he's overplaying it. Mom's reeling him in. On screen, Eleanor's frail hand fluttered to her chest. Oh, dear, I wouldn't want that. Perhaps I should fetch my identification, just to be sure. She rose slowly, shuffling toward the sideboard where she had hidden her purse. The moment she turned her back, Alex's expression hardened. He slipped a small vial from his pocket and, with a quick glance at the door, uncapped it. A few drops of clear liquid dripped into the steaming cup of tea Eleanor had poured for herself earlier. He stirred it with the spoon, then set it back on the saucer as though nothing had happened. My breath caught. He's drugging her. I hissed. Daniel's face drained of color, his hand tightening on the laptop. We've got it on camera. Every angle. I reached for my phone to call Harris, but before I could, headlights swept across the feed. The front door burst open, and Detective Michael Harris strode into the frame with 2 uniformed officers at his back. Hands where we can see them. Harris barked. Alex froze, the vial still half concealed in his fist. The officers wrenched it away, cuffing him before he could protest. Papers scattered from his briefcase onto the carpet, the quitclaim deed fluttering like a guilty flag. Eleanor, still steady on her feet, turned with a calmness that belied the danger she had just been in. Oh my, she said, her voice deceptively frail. I suppose tea time is over. From the car, relief flooded me so sharply it brought tears to my eyes. The trap had worked. They had him, red-handed, vial, deed and all. The next morning, I was back at the precinct, sitting with Daniel and Eleanor in a sterile hallway that smelled of disinfectant and burnt coffee. Behind the closed door of an interrogation room sat Alex, the man who had nearly poisoned Eleanor the day before. Through the narrow window, I could see him leaning back in his chair, arms crossed, a smirk plastered on his face as if this were nothing more than an inconvenience. Detective Harris stood across from him, sleeves rolled up, voice steady but edged with steel. We've got you on camera, Alex. The vial, the deed, the attempt to drug an elderly woman. You think a jury is going to buy your act of innocence? Alex shrugged, his smile never fading. I acted alone. I don't work for anyone. Golden Years Foundation? Never heard of it. Eleanor, seated beside me, let out a sharp breath. He's lying through his teeth, she whispered. Of course he works for them. They sent him. Inside, Harris leaned closer, his hands planted firmly on the table. Then, why carry pre-prepared contracts with their name on it? Why drop their brochures at senior centers? Alex's eyes flickered for just a second before he recovered. Found them. Reused them. Doesn't matter. I'll take the fall. No one else involved. The silence that followed was thick. Harris studied him, then turned and walked out, shutting the door behind him. When he joined us in the hallway, his expression was grim. He's stonewalling. Either he's terrified of whoever's pulling the strings, or he's been told to take the heat himself. Either way, it's clear he's just a pawn. My stomach twisted. So what happens now? If he refuses to connect it to Golden Years, won't they just cut him loose and replace him with someone else? That's exactly my concern, Harris said. He rubbed a hand across his face, the exhaustion etched deep in his features. The evidence we have, attempted poisoning, fraudulent deed, is enough to put him away, but it won't bring down the entire network. The foundation will shrug, deny knowing him, and keep going. Daniel's jaw tightened. So we've risked everything for nothing. Not for nothing, Harris corrected, though his voice was weary. We've proven their methods. We just haven't tied it back to the larger operation yet. Eleanor sat upright, her eyes blazing. Then we need a direct link. Someone who can identify them, place them in the same room. Harris was quiet for a long moment, then finally nodded. Your mother-in-law, Margaret Whitmore. She's met with their people before, hasn't she? If she can positively identify one of them, especially in a controlled setting, it could be enough to force the DA's hand. My breath caught. Margaret, stubborn, suspicious, convinced I was plotting against her. I couldn't imagine her cooperating, not after accusing me of wanting her apartment for myself. Detective, she doesn't even trust me. How do you expect her to help? Harris's gaze was steady. Because she'll have no choice. If she wants to keep her home, she has to face them. This may be the only shot we get to tie the organization directly to one of their operatives. The weight of his words pressed down on me. I thought of Margaret in her recliner, clutching that worthless promissory note like it was gold, refusing to believe me even as the evidence piled up. Would she even see the truth if it stood right in front of her? Still, deep down, I knew Harris was right. The case couldn't end with Alex alone. We needed Margaret. Whether she believed me or not, she was the key. The day of the hearing arrived with a tension that sat heavy on my chest. The courthouse smelled of old paper and polished wood. The hum of fluorescent lights filling the quiet as we waited in a small witness room. Margaret sat across from me in her wheelchair, her silver hair pinned back, her eyes sharp despite the lines etched deep into her face. She had insisted on wearing her best wool coat, the one she used to wear when managing the factory years ago. Stubborn pride radiated from her, but beneath it, I caught glimpses of unease. Detective Harris leaned in, speaking gently. Mrs. Whitmore will show you photographs and have you observe in person if necessary. Just tell us if you recognize anyone you dealt with. Margaret sniffed, her chin tilting upward. Of course I will. I know who I spoke to. I'm not senile, detective. I wanted to reach across the space between us, to explain again that this was for her safety, her home, everything we both stood to lose. But words failed me. Too much had been said. Too much mistrust had piled up. So I stayed quiet, folding my hands in my lap as the bailiff opened the door. Inside the preliminary hearing room, the DA stood ready with a stack of files. At the defense table sat Irina, her poise unraveling as the evidence mounted. When Margaret was asked to look carefully, she didn't hesitate. Her finger lifted, steady as stone. That's her, she declared, her voice ringing out. That's the woman who came to my apartment, who promised me the world in exchange for my home. Irina's mask cracked then, a flicker of panic flashing across her face before she dropped her gaze. The DA laid out the rest. The video footage of Alex slipping the vial into Eleanor's tea, the seized quitclaim deed, the fraudulent promissory note, the testimony from Eleanor and Daniel. Piece by piece, the foundation's house of cards collapsed. Faced with mounting evidence and Margaret's unequivocal identification, the DA announced formal charges not just against Alex, but against Irina and others tied to Golden Years Foundation. Conspiracy to commit fraud, elder abuse, attempted poisoning. As the judge approved the charges, I felt my breath leave me in a rush, as though I'd been holding it for weeks. The apartment, Margaret's apartment, would remain safe. The people who had preyed on her, on countless others, were finally facing justice. When the hearing ended, Margaret's gaze shifted toward me. For once, there was no suspicion in her eyes, no sharp retort on her lips. Instead, she studied me with a long, searching look. You fought for this, she said quietly, even when I didn't believe you, even when I thought you were against me. You saved my home and me. The words stunned me more than any verdict. For nearly a year, I had lived in her shadow, shouldering her judgments, carrying her bitterness as if it were my own. To hear her acknowledgement, even grudging, felt like a door cracking open in a wall I had thought unbreakable. Eleanor and Daniel joined us in the hallway, relief written across their faces. Eleanor squeezed my hand. It's done, she said simply. Daniel's nod carried unspoken respect, a silent promise that I wasn't alone anymore. That evening, back in the apartment, I sat by the window while Margaret dozed in her chair, the faint rhythm of her breathing filling the room. For the first time, I didn't feel trapped within those walls. The weight that had pressed down on me for so long was lifting. I thought of where I had begun, buried under duty, fear, and resentment, and where I stood now. Justice had been served. The dragon I had once feared had lowered her guard. And in the wreckage left behind, something fragile but real was beginning to grow. Trust, connection, the possibility of healing. I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Margaret would never stop being strong-willed, and my life was still tangled with responsibilities I hadn't chosen. But the difference was clear. I was no longer walking it alone. With Eleanor's wisdom, Daniel's steadiness, and even Margaret's begrudging respect, a new chapter was opening. One where I wasn't just surviving, but beginning, finally, to live again.